friends and fellow thinkers. Let me begin with a simple but powerful question. What happens when an empire built on wealth, war, and global dominance begins to lose its grip? History has answered this question many times. Rome, Britain, Spain, and today we are watching that same drama unfold once again, this time with the United States of America at its center. The world is shifting beneath our feet, and the signs are everywhere. In Israel, in Ukraine, and in China. Each of these global flashpoints tells a story, not just about foreign policy or military power, but about the unraveling of an empire that once believed it could shape the entire planet in its image. Let's start with Israel. For decades, the United States has poured billions of dollars into sustaining Israel's military and political dominance in the Middle East. This alliance was never just about friendship, it was about control. Washington wanted a foothold in a region rich in oil, gas, and geopolitical leverage. But now that foundation is cracking. The global community, especially younger generations, are no longer buying the narrative of defense and democracy. They see the reality: apartheid policies, civilian suffering, and a growing international movement calling for justice. America's unconditional support for Israel is isolating it from much of the world, and the cost, morally, politically, and economically, is becoming unbearable. The empire is bleeding legitimacy in real time. Now, look at Ukraine. Here lies another theater of imperial contest, the United States against Russia, each trying to claim the upper hand in Europe's political and economic future. The U.S. thought it could weaken Russia with sanctions, with NATO expansion, and with another proxy war, but instead it has drained its own resources, split Europe's unity, and strengthened Russia's partnerships with countries like China and India. Meanwhile, Americans at home are asking, why do we have billions for bombs but not for healthcare, housing, or education? The empire's priorities are showing, and they reveal not strength but decay. An empire in decline turns outward to blame others while its own people suffer in silence. And then China. China, the economic powerhouse that has become America's greatest fear and rival. But let's be clear, China didn't steal America's power. America gave it away. When U.S. corporations realized they could make more profit by outsourcing production, they sent jobs, factories, and entire industries to China. They traded workers' dignity for shareholders' dividends, and now they panic as China surpasses them in technology, infrastructure, and global influence. The irony is bitter. Capitalism, in its endless hunger for profit, has built the very competitor that now challenges American dominance. When you connect these dots, Israel, Ukraine, China, you begin to see the larger picture. The American empire is not collapsing because of some foreign enemy. It is collapsing because of its own contradictions. You cannot build an empire on endless war and expect peace. You cannot build an economy on exploitation and expect equality. And you cannot call yourself a democracy when wealth, not the people, decides policy. This is not a story of foreign defeat. It is a story of internal rot. The U.S. once exported hope, innovation, and culture. Today it exports weapons, debt, and fear. The empire is losing the moral argument, and that, more than military losses, is what ends empires. The world is turning multipolar. Nations are rising, alliances are shifting, and people everywhere are beginning to question whether the American century is finally over. And perhaps it is. So what does this mean for us, the people living in the heart of the empire? It means we must wake up. We must see through the illusion of power that hides a society in crisis, where billionaires thrive while millions live paycheck to paycheck. It means understanding that when an empire ends, it is not only a geopolitical event, it is a human one. It is about families, futures, and the fight for dignity. The fall of empires is not the end of civilization. It is the beginning of something new. The question is, will we build that new world based on justice, equality, and cooperation, or will we cling to the dying dreams of domination? The idea that America's global leadership is crumbling is no longer a radical statement, it's a visible reality. The world that once looked to Washington for guidance now watches with skepticism, doubt, and even defiance. Once hailed as the guardian of democracy and capitalism, the United States now stands at a crossroads where its influence is challenged, its credibility questioned, and its authority fading. The cracks in this empire's armor are no longer subtle. They are loud, undeniable, and increasingly dangerous. The very system that once allowed the U.S. to dominate geopolitics is turning inward, exposing the contradictions between what America preaches and what it practices. For decades, the American narrative was built on a carefully curated illusion that its wars were for freedom, its trade policies for prosperity, and its alliances for stability. That illusion is dissolving. The invasion of Iraq, the endless wars in the Middle East, and the chaotic handling of conflicts like those in Afghanistan and Ukraine have revealed something much deeper, an empire struggling to justify its own existence. The rest of the world has begun to see through the rhetoric. Nations that once followed America's lead are now asserting independence. They are forming their own alliances, developing their own economies, and rejecting Washington's habit of moral lecturing while committing geopolitical double standards. The myth of the benevolent superpower is collapsing under the weight of hypocrisy. In the eyes of millions, the U.S. no longer represents stability. It represents intervention. It no longer symbolizes democracy. It symbolizes domination. Every drone strike, every regime change, every sanction has left behind resentment, not respect. And in a world connected by digital media, the truth can no longer be buried under propaganda. The images of destruction in Gaza, the suffering in Ukraine, and the economic coercion of developing nations circulate globally, undermining every word of American diplomacy. The empire's moral narrative, once its greatest weapon, is now its greatest liability. At home, the crisis of legitimacy is equally severe. When citizens see trillions spent on foreign wars while their own cities crumble, when politicians talk about freedom abroad but ignore poverty and homelessness at home, the message is clear: empire has taken precedence over people. That dissonance between domestic reality and international ambition is unsustainable. The American middle class, once the engine of the empire, is shrinking, wages are stagnant, and inequality is exploding. The world sees this and understands that a nation that cannot care for its own citizens cannot claim to lead others. The erosion of global leadership is not about a sudden loss of power. It's about a slow, systemic loss of trust. Trust in America's word, its motives, and its ability to lead with fairness. Allies no longer rely on Washington as the ultimate arbiter of world order. Even Europe, long dependent on American military and financial backing, is seeking greater autonomy. The global South, too, is rising in defiance, building institutions that no longer revolve around the dollar or the dictates of Washington. The multipolar world that America tried to prevent is now emerging precisely because of its own arrogance and overreach. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The end of American dominance isn't happening on the battlefield. It's happening in the minds of people around the world. The empire's image, once polished by Hollywood, media, and power, is now tarnished by endless conflict and inequality. You can't sell democracy while practicing plutocracy. You can't preach peace while funding wars. The mask is slipping, and the world is no longer afraid to say what it sees. The U.S. still possesses unmatched military strength and economic clout, but power without moral authority is brittle. Every empire in history has learned this lesson the hard way. When fear replaces respect, when allies become critics, when citizens lose faith in their institutions, the end has already begun. The decline of American global leadership is not an overnight event. It's the predictable result of decades of hubris, greed, and denial. And like every empire before it, the fall won't come with a bang. It will come with a slow, steady realization that the world has moved on. There was a time when the United States could present itself as the moral compass of the world, the defender of democracy, freedom, and human rights. That era is fading fast, and nowhere is this loss of moral authority more visible than in its unwavering support for Israel. What was once framed as an alliance based on shared values has turned into a glaring symbol of hypocrisy, exposing the deep contradictions at the heart of American foreign policy. The images coming out of Gaza, shattered homes, starving children, entire families wiped out in seconds, have pierced the global conscience. Yet Washington continues to justify, fund, and defend every action, every bomb, every act of collective punishment as self-defense. The world is no longer buying it. The U.S. may still control the narrative in its own media, but the global audience has changed, and so has the truth. Each new wave of violence chips away at America's moral standing. How can a nation that claims to champion democracy abroad turn a blind eye to what countless human rights organizations describe as apartheid and ethnic cleansing? How can it speak of freedom while financing occupation? These are not rhetorical questions anymore. They are global accusations echoing in universities, parliaments, and protests from London to Johannesburg, from Paris to New Delhi. The U.S. finds itself isolated in votes at the United Nations, condemned by allies who once stood quietly behind it. The notion that America stands on the side of justice has become indefensible. The empire's credibility, once built on ideals, now stands exposed as transactional, selective, and deeply self-serving. The political establishment in Washington treats the relationship with Israel as untouchable, as if moral scrutiny itself were treasonous. This rigidity is a sign not of strength, but of decay. Empires in decline cling hardest to their most controversial allies because they confuse loyalty with legitimacy. But loyalty to injustice cannot sustain global influence. Every dollar sent to fund Israel's military machine is a dollar that reinforces the perception that America's principles are for sale. The language of shared democratic values has become a hollow slogan echoing against the reality of censorship, repression, and occupation. The moral compass that once guided U.S. diplomacy now spins aimlessly, pointing nowhere. Social media has changed everything. No longer can narratives be tightly controlled by corporate networks or government-approved talking points. Ordinary people around the world can now see the raw, unfiltered consequences of U.S.-backed policies, the smoke rising over Gaza, the cries of children in rubble, the grief of mothers holding lifeless bodies. Those images travel faster than any political justification. They ignite outrage, empathy, and awareness in a way official statements never could. And every viral image erodes what little moral capital Washington has left. America's silence in the face of suffering has become louder than any speech it can give about freedom. Even within the United States, the tide is shifting. Young Americans, activists, and even members of Congress are beginning to question the narrative that once went unchallenged. The generational divide is widening. The older establishment clings to outdated Cold War loyalties, while the younger generation sees the stark human cost of these alliances. Universities are becoming battlegrounds of conscience, and protests are turning into movements. For the first time in decades, the moral authority of the U.S. government is not being attacked from outside. It is being questioned from within. Internationally, this moral erosion carries enormous consequences. Countries in the global south, once pressured into silence, are speaking out. Leaders across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are rejecting America's calls for solidarity when they see the double standard on display. How can Washington demand that others uphold human rights when it bankrolls violations of those same rights elsewhere? The hypocrisy is impossible to hide, and it's driving nations toward alternative alliances. Alliances that promise respect rather than domination. The erosion of moral authority doesn't just damage America's reputation, it shifts the balance of global power. In the end, what makes this moment so historic is not just the bloodshed in Gaza or the protests in Western capitals. It's the recognition that the empire has lost control of the story. The world no longer sees the United States as a neutral arbiter of peace, but as an enabler of oppression. Every justification, every veto at the UN, every televised defense of Israel's actions deepens the world's disillusionment. When an empire loses its moral voice, it loses the one thing power alone can't buy: trust. And once that trust is gone, no army, no economy, and no propaganda machine can bring it back. The decline of moral authority is the silent fall of empire, and America is living that fall in real time. The war in Ukraine was supposed to reaffirm America's global strength. A moment to reassert its dominance, to show the world that Washington still dictated the balance of power. Instead, it has become a mirror reflecting the deep fatigue, contradictions, and moral confusion of an empire in decline. The United States entered this conflict not directly, but through its vast network of influence, funding, and arms shipments, a familiar pattern of proxy warfare that echoes the Cold War's most dangerous games. But this time, the outcome is different. The cost is rising, the support is fracturing, and the world is beginning to see what this war truly represents: not a defense of democracy, but a desperate attempt to maintain global control in a rapidly changing world. The rhetoric has been grand: defending freedom, standing with Ukraine, resisting aggression. Yet behind these slogans lies a much colder reality. The U.S. is not fighting for democracy in Ukraine. It is fighting for hegemony. It is fighting to preserve a world order in which American interests come first, and every other nation must align or suffer the consequences. But this strategy, once effective, is now unraveling. Russia has not collapsed under sanctions. Europe is growing restless as energy prices soar and economies strain. And in the United States, ordinary citizens are beginning to ask why their tax dollars are financing a foreign war while infrastructure crumbles, healthcare costs explode, and the cost of living suffocates millions. The myth of endless American capacity is fading under the weight of domestic neglect. Every great empire, at the height of its power, mistakes overreach for strength. That's exactly what is happening here. The billions funneled into Ukraine are not an investment in peace. They are a symptom of addiction, an addiction to global dominance. Washington has convinced itself that another proxy war can secure its fading influence. But wars today don't just drain treasuries, they expose priorities. When a nation spends more on weapons abroad than education or housing at home, it reveals what truly drives its leadership. The U.S. political elite can deliver speeches about unity and liberty, but their actions reveal a system built on profit and militarism. The defense contractors thrive, the stock markets surge, and the war machine turns endlessly, while the working class pays the price. The tragedy is that this war, like so many before it, is being sold as moral necessity rather than geopolitical strategy. The narrative is designed to evoke emotion, not reason, to make citizens believe that endless funding and sacrifice are acts of virtue. But beneath the moral language lies a brutal calculus: weaken Russia, contain China, and remind Europe who leads the Western alliance. Yet even that calculus is failing. The rest of the world is not rallying behind Washington. It's quietly stepping back, observing how an empire fights to keep its grasp on power. The global South, in particular, sees hypocrisy, the selective outrage, the double standards, the silence on other conflicts where American interests are at stake. The message is clear: U.S. moral authority ends where its geopolitical interests begin. The war in Ukraine has also revealed the limits of Western unity. European nations, while publicly aligned with the U.S., are facing internal fractures. Economic pain, rising populism, and social unrest are testing the resolve of even the most loyal allies. The United States wanted to isolate Russia. Instead, it has isolated itself from a world tired of its lectures and interventions. The longer this conflict drags on, the more it exposes that American power is no longer measured by its ability to win wars, but by its ability to sustain illusions. And illusions, no matter how well funded, eventually collapse under the weight of reality. Back home, that reality is already setting in. Americans are growing weary of foreign entanglements that promise freedom abroad but deliver despair at home. The patriotic language no longer convinces those struggling to pay rent or buy groceries. They see the pattern: endless wars, endless spending, and endless suffering, all justified in the name of democracy that feels increasingly hollow. Every empire that dies begins with this disconnect. When the citizens realize that the glory they're told to defend is not theirs to share. The Ukraine conflict, then, is not simply about territory or security. It's about identity. It exposes what America has become: a nation more comfortable funding destruction abroad than solving crises within its own borders. The propaganda may still work for some, but the truth is seeping through. The empire is tired, its motives are transparent, and its moral mask is slipping. The proxy war that was meant to project strength has instead revealed fragility. The U.S. may still possess unmatched firepower, but it is losing something far more valuable: the world's belief in its purpose. And once that belief is gone, no amount of missiles or money can bring it back. When people speak of China's rise, they often describe it as a threat, a challenge to the global order, an economic rival, a political adversary. But the uncomfortable truth for Washington is that China's ascent is not the result of theft or deceit. It is the logical outcome of choices made by the United States itself. The empire built the very rival it now fears. In the relentless pursuit of profit, American corporations dismantled their own industrial base, shipped millions of jobs overseas, and empowered a nation whose discipline, planning, and ambition outpaced their imagination. The world is watching as the creator confronts its creation, and the irony is impossible to ignore. The story of China and the United States is not just about economics. It's about ideology, arrogance, and the unintended consequences of unrestrained capitalism. For decades, American leaders promised that globalization would lift all boats. In truth, it sank the working class while enriching a corporate elite that saw borders only as obstacles to profit. Factories that once powered Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh were relocated to Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Shanghai. In return, corporations gained cheap labor, higher margins, and access to vast new markets. The U.S. political establishment celebrated this as progress, calling it free trade, but it was not freedom. It was abandonment. The heart of American industry was hollowed out, and the profits that once sustained domestic prosperity flowed into the hands of multinational CEOs and investors. China didn't steal American jobs. It was invited to take them, gift wrapped in the logic of greed. Now, the consequences have come full circle. China, through strategic investment and long-term planning, has built what the U.S. dismantled: robust manufacturing, advanced technology, and global economic networks. The irony is almost poetic. While Washington spent decades funding wars and protecting oil pipelines, Beijing spent decades building railways, factories, and microchips. While the U.S. government debated budgets and debt ceilings, China was funding research, education, and infrastructure. The contrast could not be sharper. America's capitalism served shareholders. China's model, whatever one may think of its politics, served a vision. And vision always outlasts greed. The panic in Washington today is not just about losing economic ground. It's about losing control of the narrative. For decades, the U.S. positioned itself as the world's teacher, the model others should emulate. But now the student has surpassed the teacher, and the empire can't accept it. Every policy shift, every sanction, every restriction on Chinese technology is a reaction to that insecurity. America cannot tolerate competition on equal terms because it no longer knows how to compete. It knows how to dominate, how to dictate, how to consume, but not how to rebuild. The empire that once prided itself on innovation is now weaponizing fear to hide its decline. Meanwhile, China is not conquering the world through war or coercion. It is doing it through commerce, diplomacy, and strategy. Its Belt and Road Initiative connects continents through trade rather than invasion. Its investments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are creating relationships rooted not in ideology, but in mutual interest. While America drops bombs, China builds bridges, literally and metaphorically. The difference in approach has not gone unnoticed. Countries that once depended on U.S. aid are now turning eastward, drawn by promises of development instead of domination. The empire that once dictated global finance now finds itself challenged by alternative systems that bypass the dollar and ignore its sanctions. The deeper tragedy is that America's confrontation with China is not just a geopolitical struggle, it's a moral one. It reflects the decline of a nation that has lost faith in its own ability to produce, innovate, and compete honestly. Instead of introspection, it chooses blame. Instead of reform, it chooses hostility. The U.S. accuses China of manipulation, yet it was American corporations that manipulated their own system to exploit cheap labor abroad while leaving their own citizens in economic despair. The hypocrisy is glaring, and the world sees it. You cannot lecture others about fairness when your own economic model thrives on inequality and exploitation. This new era marks a turning point. The empire that once exported ideology now exports insecurity. The rise of China is not simply the fall of the U.S. It is the exposure of a truth America has long ignored. That power built on greed cannot sustain itself. Every time Washington points a finger at Beijing, it points three back at itself. The United States created the conditions for its own decline, and now it stands shocked that another nation used those conditions more wisely. History, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. The empire that tried to shape the world in its image is now being reshaped by the very forces it unleashed. Empires rarely fall because of foreign invasion. They collapse from within, eaten alive by the very systems they once used to dominate others. The United States today is living proof of that truth. Its greatest enemy is not China, Russia, or any external power. It is itself. The empire that once promised prosperity to all now serves the interests of the few. It is an empire built on economic inequality, political corruption, and social division, and that foundation is cracking. Every empire believes it is eternal until the moment it realizes it has been hollowed out from the inside. The United States is standing on that precipice, still powerful in appearance, but rotting at its core. The signs are everywhere. The gap between the rich and the poor has reached levels unseen since the Gilded Age. The wealthiest corporations and billionaires control more wealth than half the nation combined, while ordinary Americans struggle to pay rent, medical bills, and student debt. The so-called American dream, once a global symbol of opportunity, has become a cruel illusion. For millions, hard work no longer leads to success. It leads to exhaustion. The middle class, the heartbeat of the empire, is disappearing, replaced by an economy that rewards speculation over production, profit over people. The country that once built industries now builds billionaires. And behind every headline about economic growth lies a darker story of workers living paycheck to paycheck while CEOs collect bonuses worth more than entire neighborhoods. The political system, too, has become a theater of dysfunction. Decisions that shape the lives of millions are no longer made in the halls of democracy, but in the boardrooms of corporations and the offices of lobbyists. Policy is no longer about public good, it's about private gain. Washington speaks the language of democracy, but practices the politics of oligarchy. Every election brings promises of change, yet nothing changes because both parties serve the same masters: the donors, the defense contractors, the financial elites. The people vote, but money governs. The empire that once claimed to export democracy abroad can no longer practice it at home. Meanwhile, the social fabric is tearing. Division has become the new currency of control. Race, religion, gender, ideology. Every difference is amplified, weaponized, and used to distract from the real struggle class. While Americans argue among themselves, the ruling elite quietly consolidates power. The media, owned by a handful of corporations, plays its role perfectly, keeping the public entertained, outraged, and uninformed. Bred in circuses for the 21st century, the empire doesn't need to silence dissent, it just needs to drown it in noise. And as citizens fight over crumbs, the architects of inequality feast in silence. Even America's infrastructure, the bones of the nation, reveals decline. Bridges collapse, water systems poison communities, public transportation decays. The empire that once sent men to the moon now struggles to maintain basic roads. Education, once the path to advancement, is buried under debt. Healthcare, a fundamental human right in every developed nation, is treated as a business. Life expectancy is falling, suicide rates are rising, and addiction has become a silent epidemic. These are not the signs of a thriving power. They are the symptoms of a dying system. You cannot lead the world when you cannot heal your own people. And yet, even in the face of such decay, the illusion of greatness persists. The flag still waves, the slogans still echo, and the empire still tells itself it is exceptional. But the rest of the world sees through the performance. They see a nation obsessed with dominance, yet incapable of introspection, a country that preaches freedom while its citizens are chained by debt and fear. The empire's decline is not measured by the size of its military, but by the emptiness of its soul. When the pursuit of profit replaces the pursuit of purpose, decline is not a possibility, it is destiny. The greatest irony is that America's downfall will not come from rebellion or revolution, but from exhaustion. The people are tired of lies, of inequality, of being told that endless struggle is normal. History shows that empires fall not when they are defeated, but when their people stop believing. And belief, once lost, cannot be forced back. The American empire's collapse will not be sudden, it will be silent. a slow surrender to its own contradictions, a fading of faith in the very ideals it once claimed to represent. The empire is not being destroyed by enemies. It is being abandoned by its own dreamers. For the first time in nearly a century, the world is no longer orbiting around a single power. The illusion of a unipolar world, one where Washington's word was law, is fading into history. We are witnessing the birth of something new, something uncertain, something unstoppable, a multipolar world. The age of the American empire, where global politics, economics, and culture bent to one nation's will is ending. And though the U.S. continues to project confidence, the cracks in its dominance are widening with every passing day. The center of gravity is shifting from west to east, from the few to the many. Power is no longer concentrated, it's dispersing, and that dispersion marks the beginning of a new era that will redefine global order for generations to come. The shift did not happen overnight. It began quietly, with nations that had long been subservient to U.S. interests beginning to question the cost of obedience. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, once labeled as the developing world, are no longer waiting for Western approval. They are building their own trade networks, their own institutions, their own systems of exchange. The world's economic arteries are being rewired. No longer does Washington hold the financial chokehold it once did through the dollar and the IMF. New alliances, new currencies, and new agreements are emerging. BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, regional partnerships, each one eroding America's monopoly on global influence. What we are seeing is not rebellion, it is liberation. The global South is no longer asking for a seat at the table. It is building its own table. The United States, once the master architect of global order, now finds itself unable to adapt. Its foreign policy is trapped in nostalgia, still acting as if it is 1991, still fighting wars it cannot win, still believing it can dictate terms to nations that no longer listen. The old tactics of sanctions, threats, and moral posturing no longer command fear. They provoke defiance. When Washington sanctions one nation, others rally around it. When it tries to isolate China or Russia, it finds itself isolated instead. The empire that once prided itself on containing others now finds itself the one being contained by the very global currents it set in motion. The rise of multipolarity is not just geopolitical, it is psychological. For decades, nations were taught to equate modernization with westernization, success with submission, progress with American approval. That myth has crumbled. The digital age has made information borderless, and people everywhere can now see how power truly operates, who profits, who suffers, and who lies. The myth of moral superiority that sustained U.S. dominance no longer holds weight. The wars, the coups, the propaganda, all of it is visible in real time. And once a people sees through empire, it cannot unsee it. Economically, the consequences are seismic. China's rise as a global manufacturing and innovation hub, Russia's control of key energy routes, India's expanding digital power, and the resurgence of regional trade within Africa and Latin America. All of these signal a shift away from dependency on Western economies. The world's future markets are not in Wall Street skyscrapers, but in the ports of Asia, the tech hubs of India, and the oil fields of the Middle East. The U.S. still has immense resources, but it no longer has exclusive access or control. Power, once centralized, is now plural. Influence, once unquestioned, must now be negotiated. The empire that once demanded obedience must now learn humility. And that is a lesson it has never been good at learning. But what makes this transition truly historic is that it is not merely political, it is civilizational. Different models of governance, different values, different philosophies of progress are emerging. The Western notion that liberal capitalism is the final stage of human evolution has been shattered. There is no single path to success, no single cultural blueprint for modernity. This terrifies Washington because it undermines the core myth of its exceptionalism. For the first time, the world sees that you can achieve power without imitation, that prosperity no longer requires American permission. The fall of unipolarity does not mean chaos, it means balance. It means a world where nations can define their futures without fear of punishment. It means an end to the moral monopoly of a single empire. Yet for the U.S., this new reality feels like decline because it cannot imagine a world where it is not the center. The truth is, the empire's end is not necessarily the world's fall. It might be its renewal. But for an empire built on the illusion of eternal dominance, accepting that reality will be the hardest task of all. What we are witnessing is not just the end of an era. It is the awakening of a world that no longer needs permission to stand on its own.